Hello, good morning. Welcome to episode number 229 of Learn with Lorna, where we are looking at further evidence from the Dewar Committee. I'll explain all about what that is in a second. My name is Lorna McGinn, the Community Engagement Officer for the Highland Archive Service. We have 4 archive centres in the Highlands of Scotland where we look after historic documents dating back to the 1200s. We have our centres in Inverness, in Fort William, in Portree and in Wick. This series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in Learn with Lorna. But if you're able to donate towards our work and want to help us to continue to do all the range of things that we do, then we really very much appreciate that. So welcome to episode number 229, where we are returning to a favourite subject which we last looked at in episode 155, the Highlands and Islands Medical Service and the evidence of the Dewar Committee. That episode told the story in detail, so I'm not going to go right into that, the history of the Dewar Committee, what it was and what it was established, but I will give a quick overview so that this episode makes sense if you haven't seen the earlier one. The Dewar Committee was constituted in 1912. Here is an extract from the 2012 centenary exhibition that we were involved in to set the scene. The year 2012 marks the centenary of the Highlands and Islands Medical Services Committee, commonly referred to as the Dewar Committee. The committee was constituted to look into medical service provision in the Highlands and Islands after it was realised that crofters were not covered by the 1911 National Insurance Act. The Dewar report not only gave a unique insight into the social landscape of the Highlands and Islands in the early 20th century, but also set out a compelling case for healthcare reform. This led to the first state-provided health service in the world, the Highlands and Islands Medical Service, which revolutionised medical provision across the Highlands and Islands and is considered to be the precursor to the National Health Service. So, the committee was established to assess the state of healthcare provision in the Highlands and Islands, to gather evidence about people's state of health, their understanding of what healthcare provision was, their use of health services, their beliefs about health, their practices around healthy eating and so on, and then to produce a report with recommendations based on that evidence. And what we're looking at today is the evidence that was gathered. The evidence was gathered by questionnaire and then in 17 public sessions held across the Highlands and Islands. The committee interviewed 178 witnesses. They produced 23,558 paragraphs of evidence about health and healthcare in the area in 1912. And what resulted was a very, very detailed picture of the Highlands and Islands just before World War I. And it's that evidence that we're looking at today. So let's start by looking into some examples of the evidence gathered that relates to illnesses. So the committee would go around asking all sorts of questions about visits to doctors, about nursing and midwifery provision, about food and water, about housing and social situations, all sorts of different things. And I want to start the first bit by looking at the questions and the answers that relate specifically to illnesses and diseases and health problems that the committee heard about. On the third day, on the 19th of August 1912, a meeting was held in the Town Council chambers in Inverness. And among those called as a witness was Dr. Bruce, the Medical Officer of Health for Ross and Cromarty. And amongst other things, he spoke about the work of the infectious diseases nurse who deals with whooping cough, measles, scarlet fever and typhoid. He explained that her work quite often involved moving in with patients as necessary and treating any other illnesses as required. Reverend John McCaskill, the United Free Church minister of Kinlochbervie, spoke to the committee on their 13th day, the 10th of October, in Reconnach in Sutherland, and his evidence includes this. So I'll miss out all the paragraph numbers that are included in this, but you were proposing as a parish council to build shelters for them. Yes, we did that some years ago. However, we have delayed in erecting them until we see what the Insurance Commission will do. So you have not, in fact, erected these shelters yet for infectious diseases? No. Is there a good deal of consumption? Yes, there's a good deal. Is it increasing? Yes, I'm very sorry to say that it is. Is it imported from the south? I'm afraid not. There are several causes contributing to the increase of consumption in the Highlands and Islands. What are these causes? Lack of proper isolation is one of them. Consumption now is notifiable and the patient ought to be compulsorily isolated. What next? Well, again, there is the poor feeding of children. What is the other reason? Close intermarriages. Do they not like to marry with strangers? In isolated parishes, it is very difficult for them to do that. It's quite interesting, just not only that he's talking about the increase in infectious diseases, he's talking about the illnesses that are affecting, but his reflections on some of the causes for that, and the fact that those causes will be very different, or in some of these opinions they're different in different parishes, in different environments. The following day, the committee was in Lewis, and they were speaking to witnesses in Stornoway's Town Council chambers. And Dr. Donald Murray confirmed to the committee that more than half of the deaths caused by TB in Inverness-shire were in Lewis, which he attributes to infected milk. And this was also referenced in a different interview, an interview with Dr. Benjamin Craigie Bell in Orkney, who said, he's asked, have you had any experience of milk epidemics? And he says, yes, several. That is a thing I'm rather interested in, because what I say is this, that there is no use in setting out on great expenditure to provide for disease after it has occurred. What you want are commonplace regulations to prevent the disease occurring. Practically every epidemic of scarlet and typhoid that we have had in Orkney has been caused by gross negligence in the supervision of the milk supply, and if attention had been paid to it, it could have been obviated. It's perfectly ridiculous to wait until you are certain that a case is scarlet fever or typhoid, and then after you've infected 50 people you call in the medical officer. What I put in my reports is this: when any disease occurs on a farm or among retailers of milk, they are not to wait until they know what's up. They should call in a doctor at once and let the doctor say whether it's a case of typhoid or pneumonia or influenza, etc. So the committee say, would you make any illness at a cow farm or dairy notifiable then? Yes, and any alteration in the sanitation. About 20 years ago, I was called one Saturday afternoon to a young lady about a mile from the town and a little boy in the town. Both of them had scarlet fever. Now, we had not had any scarlet fever for 3 years, and I said to my partner that there must be some common cause, and he told me to find it out. They were both getting their milk from 2 places, but had one place in common. I went to the farm, and the farmer said there was nothing wrong, and I examined all of his family and went away disappointed. When I was coming down rather a steep hill, I noticed a girl labouring up the hill with a basket. I came nearer to her and saw that she looked rather pale and breathless and looked ill, and I said I could carry her basket for her. I asked her where she was going, and she said, "Oh, who are you?" And I said, "I'm a doctor." And she said, "Oh, will you tell me what is wrong with my hands?" And her hands were all peeling. She evidently had scarlet fever. And that girl had only come temporarily to the farm to help them because their own girl was on holiday. She had come from the islands. I asked her if there were any sore throats where she had come from, and she said yes, there were some, but none very bad, but that she had a sore throat herself. I went to the doctors in town, and I said to them that if they had any sore throats between then and Monday, they were to be sure that it was scarlet fever. We had 17 cases before the Monday. On another occasion, we had something like 60 cases of diarrhoea one Sunday, and I found they were all coming from one milk supply. So it's just very, very interesting to watch at this time that we know this, that across hundreds of years the way we've understood disease and disease transmission has changed, but for him to tell that story reflecting back on how he has traced the evolution of that illness, he goes on to say, for that particular one, was the milk supply in the town or the country? I think they were both in the parish of St Ola. I went to the farm and I found that the water supply had run short, and the man had taken an old burnt ale cask, about the most dangerous thing that could be had, and had filled it out of a neighbour's well and washed the dishes with it and poisoned all the people. There was one house in which only one person escaped out of 5, and the reason that that person escaped was that he had taken curds and whey that day instead of milk. They go on to ask Dr. Bell, do you find your town council ready enough to do the things that you suggest? So they're interested in how are diseases happening, how are they spreading, but what's being done, are doctors being listened to, are people following advice? So do you find that your town council are ready enough to do what you suggest? They are, but they weren't at first. The doctor must show good reason for a request to cause ratepayers' expense. I'll give you an instance of this. I was called up at 4 o'clock one morning to see a poor widow who milked in a dairy. She said that she saw in my health reports that folk should not milk the cows with infection in the house, and that a niece of hers had arrived in the steamer with a bad throat. I went up and I saw the case, and I found her with a sore throat, and I sent her to the hospital, and she had scarlet fever. I asked her where she'd got it, and she said she had left her mistress 10 days before, probably too long ago to cover incubation period. I then found that she had been in a certain house in a city. I asked if there were any children about in that house, and she said there were, but there was nothing the matter with the child, but that he was off school because he had a discharging ear. I found that she had scarlet fever, probably caught from this child. And I went to the town council and I said, this woman has given up her milk for the sake of the public. You will have to give her 10 shillings a week. So the older lady has said, the younger woman has got a contagious disease. It's going to come through her hands onto the cow's udders, milk the cows. That's going to be spread. So he goes to the town council and says, this woman has given up the income from her milk for the sake of the public, and you will have to give her 10 shillings a week. They said they would consider the matter, and afterwards they gave her 10 shillings a week. Poor people cannot be expected to throw away means of livelihood unless they get compensated. I found that just very interesting, the way that, you'll have heard me talk about this a lot over the years of Lorna, the way that different record series are intertwined. So you might see someone in poor relief records as, loss of income is the reason they're in the poor relief records. But that loss of income might be something like that a medical expert has said, you need to not sell your milk because of this infectious disease. So you really, from this one volume of evidence, get such a broad idea of what's going on. Another person to be interviewed during that Lewis session was Stornoway's Provost Mackenzie, and he said, or he is asked, people have some hesitation in sending for the doctor on account of the difficulty they have of getting at him, and secondly, on the account of the bill that they are likely to receive. Is that correct? And he says, yes, I may say at this stage that to supplement what I sent to Mr. Beaton, so the answer to the questionnaire he'd already sent out, I wrote down a few notes and I have them here. I'll read them. The insanitary condition of the houses is the cause of a great deal of disease, particularly syphilis, which is TB, among the sick poor. I give you this simply as the chairman of the parish council, knowing the conditions from my long experience, and knowing how we are burdened with regard to this question. As it has now been made a notifiable disease, and owing to the ravages made by this disease in Lewis, a sanatorium in Lewis is much required. The great difficulty, however, to be overcome is the provision of getting sanitary dwellings in the rural districts, and the getting of the people to call in a doctor at the earliest stage of illness. This delay on their parts tends to spread infection, particularly in the black houses, before treatment of the patient commences. So exactly what the previous person was saying, or several actually of the previous examples, saying that speed is of the essence. You need to not wait until you have a confirmed diagnosis, assume the worst, isolate. So he says, this is what I was saying with regard to sending the doctor to these houses. They only send in for the doctor when he ought to have been there before. In that way the disease has already taken a firm hold. The other subject I was going to draw your attention to is the underfeeding of children. It is much to be regretted that in rural as well as country districts, the proper feeding of the children is neglected by parents. There is far too much tea and loaf bread used, Porridge in the morning is very seldom given, and the consequence is that the children are not so robust as they were a generation or two back, when more wholesome, plain food was the rule. The periodical lectures by the Medical Officer of Health, Dr. Murray, will no doubt help to educate parents in this matter. It's funny to hear that someone in 1912 saying, our diet is absolutely atrocious now. It used to be much better a couple of generations before. You wonder what he would make of it today. So I've looked a little bit there at infectious diseases, things like TB, scarlet fever, typhoid, those things that can spread. But of course it wasn't just infectious diseases that come out of the evidence that the Dewar Committee gathered. Dr. George Sinclair in Kirkwall described the high levels of pneumonia, of bronchitis, asthma, rheumatism, kidney and heart problems and cancers, and the issues around these when there is no sponsored healthcare system. The Reverend Drummond in Perth told the committee at that hearing that many illnesses were simply being left untreated. And those who were living with chronic illnesses or problems had to really cope as best they could. Angus Pirrie, who was a handloom weaver in Rogart, who spoke to the committee on the 9th of October 1912, told them that he knew of one man who had been ill for 2 years, which he thinks was diabetes, and that the doctor visits if he happens to be around. Dental health is also discussed in the evidence of the Dewar Committee. Dr. John Webster Duffus in Canisby in Caithness told the committee that parents never brought children for dental treatment and were altogether opposed to it, not because they were afraid of their children suffering in pain at being at the dentist, but because they were completely indifferent about the importance of dental health care. It just simply hadn't hit their radar that it was something that mattered at all. And of course, a lot of those entries there I've been reading talk about trying to prevent things happening, trying to put things in place before the crisis happens. But some moments of risk and danger just can't be put off or avoided. Accidents happen, things go wrong, so do complicated pregnancies and labours. And Miss McNeill, who was a qualified doctor in Orkney, spoke to the committee on the 26th of August, and she said, they asked her, "Can you tell us anything about nursing in the district?" And she says, "Where I am, there are several widows and other persons who have done a good deal of amateur work. They've picked up a good deal from the doctors, and they're willing to help in cases where domestic help is not sufficient." And they do it quite well? Yes. They undertake maternity cases on their own account? Yes, several of the widows do very nicely. And where have they gone to be trained? Oh, they've not been properly trained, not properly speaking. They've just been trained by a local doctor? Yes. You have no one in your parish who has been away to get any training? No, not in our parish. And what is the population of your parish? I think it is about 800. And similar problems were discussed by Dr. Benjamin Craigie Bell. You attend about 20 maternity cases in a year. Sometimes I have attended as many as 80. Are you assisted by a nurse at most of them? Not a certified nurse. Just a wise woman? When I first came here, there were 3 midwives in Kirkwall, all making a living. One of them got in contact with some infectious case, and there were several deaths in a few months, and it terrified the people, so that since then we have practically always had a doctor. We find it better to get a sensible woman who knows the house and the children and does not make a fuss. And we find that she has far less chance of carrying anything from one case to the other, because she only attends perhaps 2 cases in the year, and she does not examine the patient before you come. I have a rule with my patients that no certified nurse even is allowed to examine the patient before I arrive. It's really interesting, that idea that rather than having a trained nurse who goes from case to case, you call on a local woman who the pregnant lady knows, because that will be less stressful for her, but also minimises the risk of her going from case to case. It's a very interesting thought. They go on to ask him, "Are you not paid by the lighthouse commissioners?" "Only to attend the light keepers and their families. They don't take any responsibility for confinements, because they thought that the women should come to town for that." I wired to them 2 or 3 times to tell her what to do. After the baby was born, the placenta did not come away, and I had to wire again, and then the whole thing went off all right. I never saw the woman until I vaccinated the baby, but I said to her I heard she'd had a terrible time, and she said, but when I heard there was someone at the other end, I plucked up, and that's what helped to bring me through. Remarkable set of stories. The illnesses and problems faced were often compounded by issues, as they are today. Illnesses are often compounded and worsened and complicated by issues of diet, of lifestyle, of housing, of other pressures, societal and public health pressures. And this comes through really clearly in the evidence of the Dewar Committee, just the myriad ways that lifestyle choices and lifestyle realities can change people's lives. This is the evidence of Dr. Charles Jameson in Sutherland. Can you tell us the way the natives live with regard to feeding? How are they fed? Are they undernourished? I believe most of them here are. What do they live on? Potatoes and herring for breakfast and tea. Have they got much milk? They have some bread along with it, and they get soda scones. They have cows. Yes, but they're very often dry. Do you think that potatoes, herring and bread is the diet all over this parish? I believe that's the principal thing, yes. Is there enough of it? I believe there is. I must say that for the last 10 years they've had to buy all their herring from the south. Do they not make oat cakes? They do, but not much. Have they no porridge? Sometimes. Do they not kill sheep? No, they would rather sell it about here. Do they use Indian meal here? No, not here. Do they make their milk into cheese? Crowdy, yes. I think the school children are underfed. In fact, the school medical officer says that they are not half nourished. And are you satisfied from your own observation that that is the case? Yes. So diet is a concern. So too were housing conditions causing problems. This is an extract from Dr. John Pringle Told Me, which references something no longer common in 1912, but evidently still happening and evidently still having effect on health and well-being in the Highlands and Islands. So they ask him, you don't nurse infectious diseases. What is done with them? All the family clear out. Who nurses the patient? The father. The only case of infectious disease that I had was a typhus case, and the father nursed the patient. He went about with a bag of carbolic and a bit of black tape of cloth on his jacket to show the other people that they were to keep clear of him. Did the patient survive? Yes. What did you do with the house? I fumigated it. Was it a black house? Yes, it should have been burned by rights. Had you to do that fumigation yourself? No, the sanitary officer did it. Is there a house in Harris still with cattle under the same roof as people? Yes. Where is this the case? Down in Strond near my own place. I reported it twice to the district committee and they took no notice of it. I was going to a house where somebody was sick and I was met by a calf. It was a calf that answered the door. Was there a cow there too? Yes. I reported the case twice and the sanitary inspector also reported it twice. Is this still going on? No, there was a party staying with this woman and they had a row and she pulled the house down. Am I right in saying that there are no cases now? When I was vaccinating in a certain district, I came across a case and I was told that the cow was very sick and that it had had a calf and it was in the house, but it would be out by the next day. There is no doubt that there are a few, but not very many. So, as I say, in those traditional thatched croft houses, it had been common practice. By this point it's not so much, but still enough for it to appear in the Dewar evidence in 1912 that the reality of living with cattle at one end of the house and family at the other was having an impact on people's lives. This extract from Dr. Malcolm MacLeod in Tarbet is interesting. What proportion of your patients are consumptive? It's almost impossible for me to say. A half? Quite a half of my visits, barring confinement cases, are of consumptive patients. Are there many that die from it? Yes, I think quite 50% of my death certificates are for consumptives. What locality is the consumption most in? In the island of Scalpay mostly. How do you account for it? It's overpopulated. The habits of the people are filthy and they are so ignorant. Are the houses very bad there? Yes, very bad. Have you any houses with cattle in them? No, I don't think so. But the houses are not what they should be all the same. No, far from it. I would sooner have cattle in them than the present condition of them. The people are dirtier. Does the tweed industry flourish in Scalpay? No, I think they mostly depend on herring fishing. Can you assign any special cause to the prevalence of consumption? Yes, I notice consumption in Harris people always begins in their throat. It's a common habit with the men to put fingers in their mouths. It's a filthy habit that they have. Surely smoking is an antiseptic, is it not? They pass the pipe from one to another. One boat's crew usually only have one pipe. I've known of 3 of one boat's crew dying of consumption in 1 year. Out of different families, yes. And they usually only have one pipe on board the boat. Yes, I've never known them to have 2. Do you attribute the spread of consumption to the passing round of the pipe? Yes, I do, and to their filthy habit of spitting. It's remarkable, isn't it, that it's just such a good example of how medical thinking changes, because that's the committee asking, but surely smoking is an antiseptic. In addition to physical illness and questions of public health, housing and diet, the committee also examined the subject of mental health, or lunacy as it was termed at the time. And witnesses gave evidence as to the scale of the issue in their area, and also the best treatments and the cost of providing these treatments. Some subjects absolutely never go away. On the 23rd of August, at a meeting in Thurso, Dr. Charles Macpherson, Deputy Commissioner for Lunacy for Scotland and an ex-doctor at Bonar Bridge, appeared to confirm that the administration of the lunacy laws was very much hampered in the Highlands due to the long distances involved, but that they still tried to make 4 visits a year. So they were supposed to be paying these visits to the asylum to check in, and he's saying it's difficult because of the distances involved, but they still try to make 4 visits a year to inspect the asylum. And I was interested that one of the questions he was asked was, is it your opinion that in the Highlands very often the non-pauper population, I'm going to read that question again. Is it your opinion that in the Highlands very often the non-pauper population, so the population just above the pauper line, is worse off for medical attendance than the pauper? So if you're a pauper, you're entitled to some kind of health care. If you're not absolutely below the breadline, you're just above it, are you falling through the gaps in terms of healthcare provision? Because of course, paupers, particularly those who had gone into a poor house, would have had access to medical attention. So if you are not a pauper and you can't afford to pay for the doctor, are you then missing out? And the answer was yes, and some turned to other solutions rather than trying to find the money to pay for a doctor. This is from Dr. Tolmie's evidence. Have you much tuberculosis? Yes. A good deal of bone tuberculosis? Yes. And when they have bone disease, they use the old remedies. There was a man suffering from keratitis, and he was not getting on well. It's a difficult disease to cure in an old person, and he was not getting on, and I had to go over one day, one very wild day, to see him, and when I arrived he was away from home. It was a fearful day, and he had to drive 9 miles and walk about another 6 to an old lady at Lisito. The old lady made up some rhyme and mixed some grasses with water and sand and sang. He came back and said he was a little better. The 7th son is supposed to be able to cure such diseases. I know of one case of a person who had a carbuncle on the back of his neck and it did not heal, and he got a 7th son to come to his house, and every night for a long time he put cold water on it and a 6pence around his neck. Did you have anything of that sort in Barra? Yes, they had the superstition about the 7th son there too. So just fascinating that if you can't afford to go to the doctor, you're going to try anything, because summoning professional help was expensive and time consuming, even if there was a doctor nearby. And the book of evidence abounds with examples of either of people resorting to other things or trying to get access to a doctor who often lived far away. There are so many examples within this volume of doctors living miles and hours from patients and therefore potentially carrying a greater cost. So often these doctors waived their fee or took a lower fee and they suffered for it, and that comes across through the evidence because, well, that doctors are making these sacrifices in order to see patients. And this is summed up perfectly in the evidence of Dr. James Bertie Simpson in Golspie, who says this. They ask him, so do you agree that the remuneration for which doctors get just now is notoriously inadequate for the services that they give? Yes. And they ought to be secured a better income than they have at present? Yes. Is there anything else you want to say? I don't think there is. Perhaps it is just repeating oneself. But what one feels about the crofters living at a distance is that I think it's unfair that a poor man should have mileage to pay. And when that poor man can't pay mileage, it is very unfair that the doctor should pay it, which in a great many cases he does. So as far as these poor people are concerned, your view is that they should have free medical attendance, the same as they have free education? Yes. And of course it wasn't just doctors that could be called in. Some places were lucky enough to have a nurse. Various types of nurse with varying levels of qualification and training. As we saw there, some places had just a local woman with no training at all, or no book training. As midwives, some had trained nurses, and so on. This is an extract from the evidence of J. Patton McDougall, who was Registrar General for Scotland and Vice-Convener of the County of Argyll. He says, or the committee say to him, you give us some interesting information in regard to Argyllshire in your Pressy. There are 45 inhabited islands, and if we accept Mull, Islay, Seal, Dewar and Colonsay, they are almost all without a resident doctor. Yes. Is there a large population on these islands? I have instanced 2 cases in my Pressy, and I have added a third. There is a cluster of islands in the neighbourhood of Scarborough which adjoins Dewar. Scarborough and a number of islands about there have a population of about 61 inhabitants, and they belong to the parish of Dewar. Now, supposing there was an illness in Scarborough, it would be almost impossible to reach it. The Gulf of Corryvreckan is between Scarborough and Dewar, and the nearest doctor is on the other side of Easdale. I think you may take it that if a case of illness occurred in Scarborough, unless in very fine weather indeed, it would be very difficult for a doctor to get there in reasonable time. Do you know what they do when they do want a doctor? I don't know of any case in point in Scarborough. Then I must mention Gia and Cara, where there are 326 inhabitants. In Gia there is no doctor, but there is a nurse. And I have here the report of the Secretary of the Nursing Association, which shows the conditions in that island. The Secretary says in that report, a long-felt want was met by a Queen's nurse being sent to the island in May 1911. As so often happens when medical aid is required, stormy weather makes it well nigh impossible on many occasions for a doctor to come across. But since Nurse Evans came to the island, there is a feeling of quiet security in the minds of the inhabitants, which is welcomed as well as greatly appreciated by them. On many occasions it has been found not necessary to send for a doctor, when without a nurse it would have been imperative. Nurse Evans has attended 63 patients, made 596 visits and attended 2 confinements. That shows what can be done by a nurse and the enormous benefit she is. I think there is a doctor on the mainland, either at Tarbert or at Tainlone. Can you tell us how that nurse is paid? That nurse is paid by local contributions. If desired, I can put in the report of the Argyll Nursing Association. I may say that association has a capital fund of something like £12,000. We now have a staff of 31 nurses, including 4 candidates in training. The association exists for the nursing of the poor in their own homes. The fund was got together some 15 years ago by a bazaar and other means, and there is contributed from the county to upkeep and maintain these nurses some £1,600 or £1,700 a year, and the number of cases nursed during the last financial year was 1,485. The number of visits paid by the nurse was 36,186, and the number of casual visits numbered 371. You really get a sense there of how valuable that nurse has been to that community. Incidentally, he also spoke about the importance and the efforts of trying to recruit and train Gaelic-speaking nurses. And I find it interesting in this volume that the men who are interviewed, and there are multiple women interviewed as well, but the men who are interviewed often speak with very high confidence about both women nurses and women doctors. And it's a view that's not always shared by patients who are still trying to get their head around the idea of female doctors. But this is from the evidence of Dr. Benjamin Bell in Orkney. There's not much inducement for a medical man to go there, is there? No. Have you found that medical men do not like to work on the islands? They always change, they only stay for a year or two. If it had not been for the young ladies, some of these islands would never have had doctors at all. The young ladies, however, have given up coming to Orkney for two reasons, one being their health, so often got injured by exposure in boats and having to drive in the middle of the night. You mean lady doctors? Yes. Then you've had lady doctors in the past in these islands, but you've not got them at present? I don't think there's one in the county just now, but we have had as many as 5 or 6 at a time. Then the people did not treat the lady doctors sympathetically. The average ability of the young ladies, I would say, was quite up to that of the men who have gone to the islands. These young ladies are just out of colleges where they have been trained by the most skillful surgeons. If a poor woman came to them with early cancer in the breast or uterus, they realised what it meant, and they sent the case at once to the infirmary, and all the thanks that they got was, "You're putting us to the expense of the fare of the steamer south," when really they were doing their duty by them. Do you not think in time people would have got to realise the value of their care? They might have in half a century, but did not affect the poor young ladies because they were left alone in many instances, and the people often thought they did not know their work. We have had some most excellent young ladies here. One of the young ladies was the daughter of a professor. We've had a lot of excellent ladies who have done well since leaving Orkney. And he's asked, the women you have had have been picked women, about the best you could have got in the medical profession. Yes, I suppose so. And interesting, it says there, at this stage, the evidence of this witness was suspended in order for him to attend an urgent case. So, great example of just that immediate having to go. So interesting that the doctors really value the women doctors, but that patients don't always. I did read as well in other evidence that patients often expected nurses, if they had female nurses in the house, they expected them to be useful generally about the house, as well as nursing to do cleaning, washing, milking the cows, etc. So, given the various challenges of getting a doctor or a nurse to you in the first place, and then paying the costs, which is very clear throughout this evidence that many just simply could not afford, many didn't call the doctor at all, and therefore died unnecessarily or were uncertified when they did die. Huge numbers of deaths were going uncertified with no doctor called in. And on the first day of the evidence gathering, which was happened in Edinburgh because it called people from central bodies, albeit with Highland experience, Dr. J. Crawford Dunlop, statistical officer of Register House, gave evidence about some of the areas most affected by lack of registration. He says, in the parish of Tongue, 60% of deaths had gone uncertified in 1910, 35% in Far, 50% in Barra, 60% in Durnish, and so on. And he noted that over the preceding 3 years, 38% of all uncertified deaths were due to old age. People just choosing to slip away rather than go to the expense of calling out a doctor. I have selected only a very, very few examples from the tens of thousands of paragraphs of evidence in this volume. I could have spoken about, at length, as you will know from me, I could have spoken about the repeated highlighting of communications as an issue, the need for telephones to be installed, the need for power supplies to be increased. There are loads of suggestions for improvements in this evidence volume. There are calls for training, for housing, for both better housing for patients but also housing for doctors. There are calls for transport options for doctors so that they don't have to walk or cycle to get to cases. There are calls for education for patients about nutrition. And perhaps most importantly, salaries for doctors so that they don't have to charge fees in the same way. And as I said at the start, this vast body of evidence was turned into a report with recommendations. Let me share with you another paragraph from our centenary exhibition booklet. The Dewar report, I'm pausing because I've said to you before, I've read this extract to you before, it always makes me feel goosebumps. The Dewar report concluded that the principle of healthcare is a basic human right, regardless of income, class or geography. Such was its impact that Parliament adopted the committee's recommendations with uncharacteristic speed and consensus. The Highlands and Islands Medical Service was established in August 1913 with an annual grant of £42,000. The service's first priority was to improve access to healthcare. Patients were to receive treatment at specified charges, irrespective of distance from a doctor's place of residence. Doctors were to be guaranteed a minimum salary of £300 per year. This was to be paid in the form of a subsidy in respect of all persons treated under the scheme, along with travelling expenses. Grants for the provision and improvement of housing were provided, and in return, doctors were required to treat all persons in need of medical attention, attend midwifery cases, help with public health and school medical services, provide their own transport, and keep registers of patients, treatments and charges. Between 1916 and 1920, the number of parish and district nursing associations increased fivefold. Constitutions were written to specifically include the treatment of patients under the Highlands and Islands medical scheme in order to become eligible for grants. This allowed for the appointment of over 100 fully qualified Queen's nurses who worked in conjunction with the GPs to provide general nursing, maternity cover and health education. And in addition, money was provided for improving nurses' housing and towards the cost of cycles, motorcycles and cars. I've said it before, but it was absolutely groundbreaking. The first state-sponsored healthcare service in the world, the model for the NHS, and all due to these paragraphs of evidence given by doctors, nurses, crofters, fishermen, school teachers, multiple different people. It's a fantastic story, a fascinating volume full of evidence. I hope you've enjoyed hearing a little bit more about it. I hope you can join me next week when I will be looking at Caithness Arts and Drama using collections from Nucleus, Nuclear and Caithness archives. In the meantime, a reminder that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series. But if you're able to donate towards our work, we really appreciate it. Thank you.